Welcome to Technology for People in a Hurry. Today, we're diving into Challenger by Adam Higginbotham, a gripping, deeply researched account of one of NASA's darkest days. Imagine this, January 28, 1986. Millions of Americans are glued to their screens as Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher turned astronaut, prepares to launch into history. But within 73 seconds, hope turns to devastation as the Challenger disintegrates in a fiery explosion, live on national television. That day became a defining moment, not just because of the tragedy, but because of the questions it forced us to confront. How could something so catastrophic happen to one of the most advanced machines ever built? The initial answer was as simple as it was shocking. A tiny rubber O-ring, a component most people wouldn't think twice about, had failed. 7 lives lost, $400 million gone, and the entire space program grounded. But here's the thing, was it really that simple? Adam Higginbotham didn't think so. In his book Challenger, he takes us beyond the headlines, beyond the O-ring, and into the heart of a story that's far more complex and far more chilling. Over 4 years of research, he spoke to over 200 people connected to the disaster: engineers, astronauts, families, and whistleblowers. He uncovered layers of systemic failures, ignored warnings, bureaucratic pressure, cost-cutting decisions that turned the Challenger mission into a ticking time bomb. This isn't just a story about a space shuttle. It's a story about systems, about the crux we ignore, the risks we rationalize, and the moments when everything we trust comes crashing down. It's a wake-up call for anyone who's ever been part of a team, a project, or an organization. Because the lessons of Challenger go far beyond NASA. They're about how we make decisions, manage risk, and deal with failure. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most infamous disasters in modern history. And trust me, by the end of this episode, you're going to see the Challenger in a way you never have before. Let's dive in. Let's step back to the late 1970s, when NASA was torn between its soaring ambitions and relentless budget constraints. The dream? A reusable spacecraft that could revolutionize space exploration. The reality? A compromised design shaped as much by politics as by engineering. The space shuttle was supposed to be NASA's crown jewel. A space truck. They called it revolutionary, reusable, and cost-effective. But the reality? It was a vision bent and broken to fit inside a $5.5 billion budget cap. Critical safety features? Scrapped. Flexibility to fix design flaws? Gone. It wasn't the bold new frontier, it was a patchwork of sacrifices. Take this shuttle's massive external fuel tank. Originally, NASA wanted it integrated into the orbiter for stability and safety. But that design was too expensive, so they strapped it to the side instead. The result? A structural hazard during launch. Escape pods for astronauts? Too costly. They were cut entirely. And then there were the solid rocket boosters, the very engines that would doom Challenger. They weren't chosen for their safety. They were chosen because they were cheaper and reusable. But here's the catch. Once those boosters were ignited, they couldn't be turned off. If something went wrong in the first 2 minutes of flight, there was no plan B. It was a gamble, a one-shot roll of the dice. And the promises NASA made? Let's just say they stretched optimism to the breaking point. They told Congress the shuttle would launch weekly. Weekly. They claimed each mission would cost just $350,000, conveniently leaving out the sky-high expenses of fuel and maintenance. And the risk? NASA projected a catastrophic failure once every 100,000 flights. The real number? Closer to 1 in 100. That's not optimism, that's delusion. And then there was the thermal protection system. Those iconic silica tiles, designed to shield the shuttle from the blistering heat of re-entry, were an engineering marvel, but also a logistical nightmare. Each orbiter required over 30,000 custom-molded tiles. They were so fragile that a slight impact could crack or dislodge them. Inspecting and repairing them after every flight turned the dream of rapid, frequent launches into a logistical joke. Now, add contractors into the mix. Companies like Lockheed Martin and Rockwell, NASA's powerhouse partners from the Apollo era, held enormous sway. These weren't collaborations, they were power struggles. NASA couldn't enforce higher standards because it needed these contractors as much as they needed NASA. The shuttle became a product of lowest bid contracts and political wrangling, not the cutting-edge engineering NASA had promised. So here's the shuttle, a spacecraft that was innovative but riddled with flaws. A system designed not for what was safest, but for what could scrape by within an unforgiving budget. It wasn't just science that took flight, it was politics, public pressure, and a gamble on national prestige. And yet, against all odds, the shuttle flew. It kept flying until January 28, 1986, when those cracks in the system became too big to ignore. Challenger wasn't a freak accident, it was the inevitable result of a system that had been flawed from the start. Let's dig deeper, because those cracks? They didn't just appear overnight. They were there all along, growing wider with every launch. Now we enter the heart of the Challenger story, not just technical flaws, but cultural ones. NASA wasn't just building shuttles, it was managing expectations, politics, and a relentless desire to succeed. This environment gave rise to something called go fever, a dangerous momentum that made stopping feel like failure. Think about it. Every time an issue came up, faulty O-rings, damaged thermal tiles, concerns about astronaut safety, it wasn't treated as a reason to pause. It was treated as a hurdle to clear, a problem to manage so the mission could move forward. And if you were the one raising concerns, you weren't just ignored, you were seen as the problem. Over time, dissent wasn't silenced with orders. It was silenced by the culture. You didn't question the launch schedule. You just didn't. Now, pair that with the PR machine NASA had become by the early 80s. Sending the first woman into space? That wasn't just a mission, it was a headline. The first African-American astronaut? Groundbreaking. A Saudi prince? A diplomatic masterstroke. And then there was Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher chosen out of 11,000 applicants to represent the idea that space was for everyone. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a symbol, a living, breathing PR campaign. And while those missions inspired millions, they weren't just about inclusion or progress. They were about keeping NASA in the spotlight, keeping the budgets flowing, keeping the dream alive, no matter the cost. And the stakes were higher than ever under President Reagan. The shuttle program had become a Cold War chess piece, a way to flex American innovation in the face of Soviet competition. NASA leaned into it hard, promising Reagan and the nation a shuttle launch every month by 1986. The problem? That promise was a fantasy. But to backtrack? To admit they couldn't deliver? That would have looked like failure. So instead, inspections were rushed, safety protocols were trimmed, and a quiet, unspoken rule emerged. Once the shuttle was on the launch pad, it was going up unless something catastrophic stopped it. Meanwhile, over at Thiokol, Alan McDonald was unraveling the truth about the O-rings. What he found was terrifying. The dual O-ring design was never meant to handle cold weather. When temperatures dropped, the rubber contracted, leaving tiny gaps. Gaps that, under the intense heat and pressure of ignition, allowed superheated gases to escape, igniting the surrounding fuel. In freezing conditions, those O-rings weren't just a risk, they were a time bomb. And here's the devastating twist. Thiokol knew. This wasn't a buried secret, but it wasn't a crisis they were willing to escalate. Instead of raising alarms, they softened the language. They told NASA that cold weather impacted the O-rings, a vague, sanitized phrase that downplayed the reality. Why? Reputation, contracts, money. Acknowledging a critical flaw could have jeopardized their relationship with NASA, so they danced around the truth, leaving the shuttle vulnerable to disaster. Now imagine the pressure mounting. NASA was rushing forward. Thiokol was protecting its interests, and the engineers, the people who really understood the risks, were shouting into a void. The Challenger wasn't just a shuttle anymore. It was becoming a perfect storm of ambition, politics, and ignored warnings. And no one seemed willing to stop it. Let's keep going, because this story is about to reach a point of no return. Picture this, January 28, 1986. The world is watching. In classrooms across the country, kids sit cross-legged, eager to see Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher turned astronaut, make history. Families gather around their TVs for a moment that NASA has framed as a celebration of human exploration, resilience, and ingenuity. And then, just 73 seconds after liftoff, the unimaginable happens. The sky erupts into a fireball, debris rains down into the ocean, and the Challenger mission ends in front of millions of stunned eyes. But here's what we now know. This wasn't an accident of fate. This wasn't inevitable. The warning signs were there. Alan MacDonald and his team at Thiokol raised alarms about the O-rings and freezing temperatures. Engineers warned about ice on the launch pad. Every red flag was visible, but the mission pressed forward. Political commitments, public expectations, and NASA's relentless go fever drowned out the concerns. The launch was unstoppable, not because it had to be, but because stopping it was unthinkable. And the consequences were devastating. Just 3 seconds into the flight, a plume of black smoke emerged, visible to no one watching, but a clear signal of failure. When the O-ring gave way, flames reached the external fuel tank, and at precisely 72 seconds, everything unraveled. The explosion ripped apart Challenger, scattering it across the ocean. And the most gut-wrenching revelation? Some astronauts likely survived the initial blast, enduring the terrifying descent toward the sea, knowing there was no escape. The Rogers Commission investigation, with Richard Feynman as its relentless truth-teller, pulled back the curtain. Feynman's simple demonstration, a piece of O-ring material submerged in ice water, made it painfully clear. His now-famous words still echo, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. But on that day, it wasn't nature that failed, it was us. It was a system that prioritized appearances over safety, momentum over caution. NASA shut down shuttle flights for 2 years and reeled from the fallout. And yet, less than 2 decades later, the Columbia disaster repeated the pattern, a technical flaw, ignored risks, and catastrophic results. These 2 tragedies didn't just tarnish the shuttle program, they ended it, a dream of reusable space travel undone by the very systems meant to make it possible. And that brings us to the close of this profound journey through Challenger. Even after nearly 40 years, the lessons from that tragic day remain etched in history. Challenger wasn't just a technical failure, it was a stark reminder of the delicate balance between ambition and caution. It showed us the cost of overlooking the small, critical details in our pursuit of greatness. But it also revealed our resilience, our ability to rise, recalibrate, and do better. Now, as we embark on a new space age, returning to the moon, aiming for Mars, and dreaming beyond, we carry Challenger's legacy as a beacon. It's not about avoiding risk, but facing it with honesty, humility, and a commitment to do what's right. This is a lesson for all of us in every part of our lives. So here's my question for you. What are the O-rings in your world? The small cracks that need your attention before they grow? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your insights. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the events that changed the way we see the world. Stay curious, stay bold, and let's keep reaching for the stars together.